First, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, accused the Russian military, so his own side, of launching a missile strike on a Wagner base camp, killing, he said, lots of Wagner fighters, although he presented no evidence for that. But he used the claim to then declare a march of justice, he called it, saying he had 25,000 fighters who were ready to fight the evil that is in the Russian military leadership, a direct threat against the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu.
In Rostov, this was no ordinary Saturday. A city of 1 million people had woken to this. The sight of armed men and armour on the streets, and tanks outside key buildings. In control here, the mercenary group Wagner. Closely linked to the state, they'd fought for Russia in Ukraine, but this was mutiny. Their leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, had gone rogue. His feud with Russia's military leadership over how the war is being fought had boiled over. At a military HQ, he told Russian generals, "We've come for the defense minister and the chief of the general staff. If we don't get them, I'll blockade the city and head to Moscow." This was treachery, said the Kremlin, a stab in the back of Russia.
Our actions to defend the fatherland from this threat will be harsh. Everyone who consciously chose the path of treason and planned the armed uprising has embraced blackmail and terrorist methods. They will be inevitably punished before the law and our people.
This is a huge headache now for the Kremlin. Not only is Russia fighting a war in Ukraine, which hasn't gone to plan, it's now having to deal with an armed mutiny at home. And although Mr. Prigozhin's criticism is directed mainly at the defense ministry, not the president, what is happening now is putting Vladimir Putin under enormous pressure.
There are reports of Wagner convoys heading north of Rostov towards Moscow. Out of the blue, a message from Mr. Prigozhin. To avoid bloodshed, he said, Wagner would turn around and return to base. A de-escalation deal that the leader of Belarus claims to have negotiated. Conflict called off.
This is one of those moments where you just have to put up your hands and say, what on earth was that about? I mean, just a few hours ago, Yevgeny Prigozhin seemed determined to march his men to the top of the hill. Then he marched them down again.
Confused, Muscovites were by the whole affair. Before, they told us Wagner was good, Svetlana says. They gave them medals for fighting in a special military operation. Now suddenly they're villains? That's hard for me to get used to. Leaving as heroes. The Wagner fighters pulling out of Rostov last night. You'd think they'd just won a war. The leader of the mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was off too. He'd just done a deal with the Kremlin to end their mutiny.
Putin.
Russia's commander-in-chief likes to project an image of strength. A mutiny on his watch is embarrassing. But is it damaging? For Vladimir Putin, will there be political fallout ahead of next year's election?
He definitely looks weaker. All elite groups will begin to think about the presidency 2024. Should they rely, as they did even 1 week before this military coup, on Vladimir Putin? Or should they think about someone new?
But there's no sign yet that someone new in the Kremlin is Mr. Putin's plan.
Vladimir Putin is determined to show that he is in charge, in control in the Kremlin. And he has the Russian state media to help him paint that picture. The trouble is, the dramatic events of the last couple of days have raised questions about how in control the Russian authorities are of the situation here.
Instability. Russians can feel it. The rebel Wagner fighters may not have made it to Moscow, but people here were watching nervously and waiting. I'm a mother with 3 children, Anna tells me. Of course I'm terrified by what has happened. We were scared these events would spread to Moscow, Nastya says. There's nothing ordinary citizens can do to influence the situation. It's decided above our heads. Many Russians tell me that. They don't believe they have the power to change what is happening in their country, to make their voices heard, to turn things around. To try to reassert his authority, President Putin summoned security chiefs to a late-night meeting. Since his TV address on Saturday, he'd stayed silent on the mutiny that he's called an act of treachery. Tonight, he addressed the nation again.
It was the patriotism of our citizens, the consolidation of the whole of Russian society that played the decisive role in these events. This support helped us overcome the most difficult challenges that our motherland faced. Thank you for this.
After a weekend of high drama, in the Russian capital, it didn't feel like victory. The mutiny had failed, but there are still more questions than answers about what had happened, and a lot of uncertainty about what's in store. Russian officials have been queuing up to denounce Mr. Prigozhin as a traitor. But Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin also blamed the West today for what had happened. Russia, he said, had faced a challenge to its stability. We need to rally around the president. But at the newspaper kiosk, I discovered a different reaction. In the dailies, it was less blame the West and much more, where is Russia heading? Russian newspapers are really interesting on this today. Even though the media landscape here is heavily controlled by the state, some of the papers are saying things the Kremlin isn't. For example, this paper says that with the mutiny, Russia has demonstrated its vulnerability to the whole world and to itself. And this paper calls what Mr. Prigozhin has done an unprecedented challenge to Vladimir Putin. It says it will have long-term consequences for Russia. Events seem to take the Kremlin by surprise. Did 2 decades in power make Vladimir Putin too confident?
After 23 years, I mean, you do lose your sense of reality. In a giant country like this, when everything is in the center and everybody is doing everything at your whim, you would be incredibly great person not to lose your marbles this way.
He's under pressure. But don't write off Vladimir Putin. One thing he's learnt since coming to power is how to stay there. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
At the Kremlin, it was pomp with a purpose. To remind Russians he's still in charge around here. Waiting for Vladimir Putin, 2,500 soldiers and guards. And the defense minister the Wagner mutineers wanted sacked. Having survived the rebellion, it was time to say thank you.
You defended the constitutional order, the lives, security, and the freedom of our citizens. You have saved our motherland from upheaval. In fact, you have stopped a civil war.
In fact, the reality was rather different. The Wagner soldiers, who'd been cheered on the streets of Rostov, had only stopped their rebellion after the Kremlin did a deal with them, promising not to press charges against them and their leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Still, Kremlin's spin is presenting this as a triumph for the president. The mutiny by mercenaries was a major challenge to Vladimir Putin's authority. But the uprising is over. And now the Kremlin is trying to change the optics to reframe what happened as a victory for the president and for Russia.